There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Sean the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. This is a special interview that I did in late March of this year as part of my series of mystery guest spots on my weekly Friday reads. And this is with the fabulous British author, Douglas Bruton. Douglas had a lot to say, and every minute of it was mesmerizing, so there was only time to include him telling me about his writing on my March 29th Friday reads. So he talked almost as long about what he'd been reading recently. So this is the full chat. If you saw that March 29th Friday reads, then you can skip ahead, and I don't know what the timestamp will be. It'll be below here once I put this in and figure it all out. But you would probably enjoy hearing him talk about his own writing all over again. However, if you didn't see that March 29th mystery guest spot on my Friday reads, you're going to want to watch the whole thing from beginning to end, and what a fascinating writer and reader Douglas Bruton is. Without further ado, here is the entire chat. I am over the moon to welcome this week's mystery guest to my channel, the writer Douglas Bruton, author of one of the best books I read last year, With or Without Angels. And he's joining us today from the Scottish borders. Welcome, Douglas Bruton.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm so pleased that you had a discussion about With or Without Angels with Lindy, and I thought your insights were very perceptive.
Well, thank you. We sure enjoyed the book on a very deep level, and it's been humming away inside me ever since. So I'll put a link to that discussion in the show notes, and we're not going to spend too much time talking about it because we got lots of other goodies that I don't know much about yet, and that you people watching don't know about. But Douglas, I find this book to be kind of difficult to encapsulate or sum up or to give somebody a flavor of in an elevator pitch sort of way. Would you like to do that for us?
Well, first of all, I didn't write the book with the intention of publishing. I write. I'm disgustingly prolific in my writing. I write lots and lots and lots, and not a fraction of it makes its way into a publisher's hands. With this particular book, I wrote it in response to two things. The book is inspired by the artwork of a man called Alan Smith. Alan Smith's widow happened to visit my wife and I, and she was so charming and so smart, and I was completely bewitched and charmed. And she said, do you know my husband's work? And I didn't. And so she directed me to a website. So the following day, I went onto the website and looked at the work. And there was a video that accompanied these photographic montages that he'd created. And the video had Alan Smith, before he died, talking about his final project. And in the video, he was charming and smart and bewitching. I just breathed all this in. And I watched the video about 7 times over the period of about 2 weeks. And I knew I was going to respond. I didn't know why I was going to respond, but I just knew I was going to respond. I didn't know how I was going to respond. I thought I might write an essay about Alan Smith. And I thought, well, no, you're not an essayist, you're a fiction writer. So I thought, well, I'm going to have to write a piece of fiction. And so I thought, well, what do I do? And I mulled it over, and I had nothing. And I sat down and I took the first picture and I just started writing. And that's quite often my method. And so it's a response to the artist. It's a response to his work. And people who knew Alan Smith in real life have come up to me since and said how much I've captured him. And I find that a little bit disconcerting because A, that was not what I was trying to do, and B, the book's about me. It's not about Alan Smith. It's about me. I'm the man in the book. I don't have cancer, but I have other ailments, the ailments that come with old age. And the book is really about me, and the thoughts that the artist has are my thoughts, but they just seem to chime so well. So it's about an artist creating his final piece of work, knowing that he's not well, thinking he's recovered, and then discovering that it's come back, that the cancer has returned, and that he's therefore going to die. The title, With or Without Angels, it came long after the book. So I wrote the book and I sent it off to Alan Smith's widow just as a gift. And it was she who encouraged me to send it to a publisher. She thought it was wonderful. I had as a kind of working title the title of Alan Smith's work, which is The New World. And I knew it was wrong, but it was just a working title. It was something to hang it on. And I was out walking one day, having thought and thought about what the title could possibly be, and coming up with nothing. Absolutely. I had lists and lists of titles, and they were all wrong. I knew they were wrong, and I kept crossing them out. And I went out for a walk, and I was about, I don't know, about 40 minutes away from the house. And I wasn't even thinking about it then. I was just out walking and enjoying the air. And suddenly this title, With or Without Angels, just dropped out of the sky. And I didn't have my phone with me. I didn't have a pen with me. So I thought, how am I going to remember this? I've got 40 minutes to walk back. So I just chanted it like a mantra for 40 minutes till I got home. As soon as I got in the door, I wrote it down. And then I rewrote the chapter that has the mention of With or Without Angels in it so that it fitted. So yeah, it was quite an odd book. And as I said, I didn't intend it for a readership. I intended it really for Alan Smith's widow to read and nobody else.
Well, we all owe her a great of gratitude that she prodded you to share it with the rest of the world, because it is
Absolutely
odd in such a wonderful, wonderful, resonant way. So we'll leave the discussion of With or Without Angels there. And you have other books, including one that's coming out soon. But before we get to that, your penultimate book, as far as I'm aware, is Blue Postcards, which came out in 2021 and was nominated for I've forgotten the precise name of the prize, so I'll let you describe that. And then please tell us about Blue Postcards.
So it was longlisted for the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction, which was a huge, huge shock to me because I didn't think I was writing historical fiction, first of all. And there were such great books on the list that I thought, what's my tiny little book doing up there with all these big writers? Whilst we were in lockdown, I kind of became obsessed in following Trump, Donald Trump. I would get up every day and clock into the news to see what lies had he told in the last 24 hours. And we had our share of lies on this side of the channel with Boris Johnson and all the Brexit stuff. And these worried me, but at the same time, they fascinated me. They had a grip on me, and I couldn't not look at the news to see what lies Donald Trump had come up with today. Got into my head, and I wanted to write something about lies. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect was I wanted to write something with blue in it, with lots of blue in it. So I wanted to write about blue. And then I kind of stumbled into an artist called Yves Klein. And he had this amazing photograph called Leap into the Void. And it's a black and white photograph that he had taken of himself leaping from a building in a Paris suburb. His arms are outstretched. He's wearing his tie and his neat clothes, and he's just leaping. And all there is between him and the pavement is air. He's going to splat on the pavement in a really tragic way. At least that's what the photograph appears to show you. It's a composite photograph, of course. In the original photograph, there are about 12 stout men holding a canvas parachute for him to fall into. But he had that taken out of the photograph and superimposed an empty street. He didn't tell you it was a lie. He told you he could fly. He had it published in a small newspaper that he produced, and he went and delivered it to all these kiosks that sell newspapers around Paris. And in it, he said he could fly. He didn't need science or rockets or spaceships to fly. Artists could fly. And he was such a great publicist, but he lied all the time. And so that kind of got into my head as well. This fascination with lies became part of what this book is. And Yves Klein, when he did his first exhibition, I think it was in Milan, he painted 13 canvases and they're all exactly the same, and they're all just blue, just a blue canvas. And he hung them at different heights in the exhibition, and he put different price tags on them, even though they were all exactly the same. And I think he sold 3 canvases in Milan, came back to Paris, and told everyone he was a sensation, told everyone that he'd sold out, this show had sold out. And they said, oh, what a shame you didn't do it in Paris. Well, he still had most of the canvases, so he said, I could do it again in Paris. So he held the show in Paris, and to advertise the upcoming show of new blue canvases, he produced a postcard. And it was blank blue on one side, the same color of blue as the canvases in the exhibition. And then on the other side, he'd written where the exhibition was going to be taking place, what the dates were, and so on. And he'd put people's addresses on. But in the top right-hand corner, he put his own postage stamp. It had the serrations that a postage stamp has, but it was just blue. And that would be great in itself. But then he did a masterstroke. He got hold of somebody in the French Postal Service, and for a small bribe, he persuaded this postal worker to accept these stamps as legitimate postage. And so they're actually franked, and these postcards were sent out. So that kind of deception and lie, which is all about art, and art lies are permissible, whereas Trump lies are not permissible. So that's kind of what the book's inspiration is.
Oh my God, it sounds amazing. And I'm just flipping through it a little bit as I'm talking, and I see it's in numbered paragraphs.
So I had this idea that I could tell a story, or in fact, in this book, there are 3 stories. I could tell a story in very few words. And so I thought, wouldn't it be nice if these were all postcard-sized pieces of information, and that each postcard-sized piece of information would have to include a reference to blue. And this would be an Yves Klein blue postcard, and it would be my blue postcard, sort of smashed together. And I would tell this complicated story of the life of Yves Klein, but then 2 other characters came in as threads. So essentially, there are 3 stories that weave in and out of each other, and you have to keep your attention on which story we're in now, because it flips without you realizing, without any announcement. At the start of the story, there's a great image at the start of the story. There's a man in Montmartre, and he's a street hustler, and he has 3 cups and the little pea, and he's kind of juggling the cups, and you have to bet on which cup the pea is under. When I wrote that, I thought initially I was just giving you a flavor of the Paris that the story is set in. But actually, it turns out that my creative subconscious is much cleverer than my conscious brain, because what it was doing was telling the reader, this writer, me, is going to juggle these 3 stories, and you have to keep your eye on where the P is, where the attention should be.
I'm mesmerized by your description of the novella, so I'm going to make my announcement now. Lindy, this book is coming in the mail to you, so we need to read it together like we did With or Without Angels. That sounds incredible. Oh my God. Now, I invited you to be my mystery guest without realizing that any day now, and very shortly, you have a new book coming out. Tell us about that one.
During lockdown, things got, for all of us, pretty bleak. And I kind of felt helpless and without hope. That kind of lingered for a while through all the kind of lockdown period. And I kind of made a decision somewhere in my head that I wanted to write something that had hope in it, that somehow it had hope in it. It wasn't that I wanted to write an optimistic book, but I just wanted to dwell on hope. So having made that decision, the universe quite often gifts you things when you call out to it. And so I called out that I'm going to write something with hope in it. And I overheard someone talking about a TV program they'd seen, which was about the skeleton of the blue whale that's in the British Natural History Museum. And they had taken the skeleton down. It had been there for 80 odd years. And they took it down to renovate it, to check that it would still hang for another 100 years. They had to fix certain bones were cracked and stuff. They had to take all the dust off. And then they rehung it once it was all repaired. They gave it a new armature. So it had an iron armature, and they made an armature out of fiberglass, I think, something much lighter. And they hung it in a slightly different location, and they hung it in a different way. So it had been hung unnaturally, just in a long line. And so they did some research, and they decided to have it diving. So it's now hanging diving in the Hintz Hall in the British Museum, in the Natural History Museum. And they gave it a name. So it never had a name before, but the scientists who had done all this work on it decided that they would give it a name. And the name that they'd given it is Hope. Obviously, I think, with the idea that in the future, the scientists hoped that blue whales would still be in the oceans in 100 years' time, and that our children and our children's children would still be seeing them. And I kind of like that. There were lots of little stories to do with this renovation project. It's crazy. This blue whale skeleton has been hanging for 80 odd years in the British Natural History Museum, and its billing is the first or the only complete blue whale skeleton in the world. But it was missing a bone, because the man who was responsible for putting it in place, he was getting his photograph taken with the blue whale skeleton when it was first hung, and he put his hands in his waistcoat pockets, a bit like Brunel in that famous picture, and he realized he had in his pocket the final bone at the end of the tail. And he thought, oh, I can't tell anybody now, because it's too expensive to bring it back down and rehang. So he just kept it, and he arranged after his death for it to be returned to the British Museum, and hopefully for his family not to be connected with its return, so that his name wasn't dragged through any kind of mud. So there's lots of little stories like that I thought were wonderful. And then I'm thinking, well, that's a nice story about hope. I quite like to use that. And then, of course, I remembered Emily Dickinson and her famous poem, Hope is a Thing with Feathers. And I thought there must be a story there. And then just on the internet, I bumped into something that said letters from Emily Dickinson to Susan Huntington, who ultimately became her sister-in-law. And the idea was that the selling point of the book was that some of these letters were quite scandalous, in that they seemed to suggest that there was a relationship between Emily and Susan of a more than romantic nature. So I thought, oh, there's something to investigate and to think about that Hope poem. And then the third thread, because I'm fond of three threads, you might imagine. So the third thread, I remembered a painting that I'd seen in the Tate Gallery in London. This was the Tate Gallery before it became Tate Modern and Tate Britain. So it's where Tate Britain currently is, but it was then called Tate, the Tate Gallery. And I was about 20. I wasn't someone who went to art galleries. I think I'd been to one gallery in my whole life by that time. But for some reason, I went to the Tate Gallery, and I came up against this picture called Hope by George Frederick Watts, a Victorian artist. And it's possibly one of the first symbolist paintings. And I just remember standing in front of it, and I wasn't an art appreciator or anything like that. I didn't have an art education very much at that time. And I just remember standing bewitched in front of this painting for like 10, 20 minutes, just mouth agape looking at this painting and feeling it kind of tugging at me. And here I was all these years later, 40 years later, thinking about writing about hope, and this painting came into my head. I thought there must be a story. Who was the model for that painting, for example? And I looked this up, and not much is written about it, but I found out about this woman who's called Ada Alice Pullen, and she became the model for Frederick Leighton, another Victorian artist. And Frederick Leighton made her change her name. She was an actress, and Frederick Leighton thought Ada Alice Pullen wasn't a particularly attractive name, so she changed her name to Dorothy Dean. And George Frederick Watts poached her away from Leighton for the purposes of painting this picture. And so I thought that's a great story about how Frederick Leighton tried to change her and model her. She wanted to be an actress. She wanted to rule the world as an actress. And Frederick Leighton just wanted her to be his model. He didn't want her to act. But given that she was going to be an actress, he thought, well, so he got her elocution lessons so that she could speak properly. He got her gigs, including some in New York. And he introduced her to the playwright, George Bernard Shaw. And it's very possible that George Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion has some of her in it because of the changes that happened to her. So I thought these 3 stories of hope, I would explore them and see where they took me. The title of the book is from one of the letters that Emily Dickinson wrote to her sister-in-law, Susan Huntington. And in it, she's enclosed a poem. And the line from the poem that I've used is "Hope never knew horizon." Hope never knew horizon. And it's this idea that hope, when you have it, doesn't necessarily deliver immediately. It doesn't necessarily deliver when you want it to or when you expect it to. It is something for the future to deliver. And so the idea of the blue whale is in the future. Hopefully it's going to still be alive. The idea that Emily Dickinson wanted to be a published poet and she wasn't published until after her death. The idea that, well, this painting, the painting called Hope by George Frederick Watts, it's such a huge painting. It's so influential that I think somebody like Martin Luther King Jr. wrote a sermon about it. Barack Obama was a fan of that particular sermon, and he, of course, had his big campaign that was called Hope. I think Roosevelt had a copy of the painting hanging in the Winter White House. So it's a painting that's gone on beyond its audience to have influence in in what would have been George Frederick Watts's future. So yeah, it's a book about hope and hope being realized beyond your expectations of when you thought it might be, or even when you wanted it to be. I think in a way it's about me, as a lot of my writing tends to end up being, that I reveal myself, that I hope that my voice will still be heard in 50 years' time when I'm dead, that people might be reading my books, that I might still be communicating at some point in the future. The thing about the relationship between Emily Dickinson and Susan Huntington, I have not said that there was a romance, precisely because scholars are divided on it. We just don't know. We only have one side of the correspondence. We only have Emily's side. We don't have Susan Huntington's letters. They were all destroyed. But what I have is I have a maid, the first maid that worked for Emily Dickinson's family, and I have her thinking there might be something, but never really being able to conclude one way or the other. So that way I tread that very careful line of planting the idea, but not coming out and saying it.
Which is one of your specialties, certainly from reading With or Without Angels. There was so many things that were left kind of vague in a way that just opened up the reader's imagination to fill it with their own thing. And so I think that might be a Bruton trademark, but maybe I haven't read enough of you to say so. But from what you're saying here, it does sound like that.
I don't really think about the audience when I'm writing. I just think about entertaining myself. And so I play games sometimes when I'm writing. I'm playing with ideas, I'm playing with the form, being deliberately deceptive or deliberately obtuse in a way that I hope is interesting and maybe even a bit fun.
Well, and I yes, all of that. Plus, I just think, just reflecting back again on my experience of With or Without Angels, that it just invites the reader in to meet you there and make my own connections and my own interpretations, and it's all kind of almost a collaborative exercise between reader and writer.
Well, I like that.
So, when is the book coming out? And is it from the same publisher? Is it Fairlight or?
No, it's not. There's a story there as well. So there's a publisher called Taproot Press. They're quite new. They're an Edinburgh publisher. One of the people who fronts that up is a man called Patrick Jameson, and he's incredibly young. I mean, I think he should be still in shorts and in school. He looks so young. He wrote something very flattering about With or Without Angels. He absolutely loved the book, and he wrote something about me that was very flattering. And I was a little bit embarrassed by how wonderful he thought I must be. And so I wrote him an email. I found his email address, and I wrote him an email just to thank him and to say that was very kind of him. And he wrote back and said, "Do you have anything?" Which is a crazy question to ask me, because I have 22 unpublished books on my computer. I'm retired from teaching now, and I try to do 3 or 4 projects a year. I write very quickly once I start writing. So With or Without Angels took 6 days. Blue Postcards took 6 days. Hope Never Knew Horizon took about 8 days. So yeah, I write very quickly. And so he said, "Do you have anything?" I said, "Well, I've got these 2." And I sent him 2 things. I said, "But I'm just about to start this." And I described it. And he said, "Well, that sounds great. Send me that when you have it done." And I think he thought I might send him that in a year when it was done. But it was done in 10 days. So I sent him that, and I said, "I'm just about to start this as well." And he said, "Oh, that sounds amazing. Send me that." So the thing that sounded amazing, and he asked me to send him, was Hope Never Knew Horizon. So it was done about a week and a half later. So I finished it on the Friday. I sent it to Fairlight Books. And then, because Patrick had asked for it, I sent it to Patrick on the Saturday. Patrick acknowledged by email on the Saturday receipt of the email with the manuscript, and said he didn't know if he'd have time to read it at the weekend. He'd see how things go. But on the Monday, it was a bank holiday in Scotland, but he had to go into the office where he works to tidy up some things, and he made a start on the book, reading it. And he hadn't intended to get very far, but he couldn't put it down, and he read it in a oneer, and he sent me an email on the Monday evening to say, "Adored it, would love to publish it." And I said, "Well, I've sent it to another publisher, but if you were to make a formal offer, I could withdraw it from this other publisher." So he sent me some details, and I said, "That sounds really great, but if you make it a formal offer, then I will definitely." So he made it a formal offer, and so yeah, it found its way to Taproot Press really quite by chance. Then I felt so bad that Fairlight Books were being let down by me because I was having to withdraw it from them. I feel some loyalty to them since they published 2 of my books. So I went to Amsterdam last year to see the Vermeer exhibition for my birthday. My wife treated me to this trip for my birthday. It was a wonderful exhibition, absolutely breathtaking. So we went in and we walked around the exhibition separately, and we met up at the end. And I said, "Oh, please come and see my favorite." So I took my wife to my favorite painting of Vermeer. So I said, "This is my absolute favorite. I just adore this." And she made a flip comment. I don't know why, but she said, "Well, of course it is. It's his sexiest." And I looked at it, and I couldn't see sex in the picture. It's called A Woman in Blue Reading a Letter. And so I looked at it, and I thought, there's no sex in that picture at all. I didn't say anything, I didn't respond. And it obviously troubled me, because 2 days after we got back, I woke up in the middle of the night, and the woman in the picture was talking to me. And I thought, oh, that's amazing. And I wrote, and I thought, that's a great idea for a book. I'll get up in the morning and I'll write some notes on that. That could be something. And then I thought, no, you'll wake up and you'll have forgotten all about this. So I thought, light on, and I made some notes. So I've made some notes, put it beside my bed, put the light off, tried to go back to sleep again, and she started talking again. I thought, nope, light back on. And this happened 4 times. About an hour and a half later, I had 12 pages of notes on this book. And so my wife went away for a long weekend to Dusseldorf with my daughter to cheer her up. So she was away for 4 days. I thought, what am I going to do with 4 days on my own? And I thought, I'll write this. I'll make a start on this Amsterdam book. So it's called Woman in Blue, and I made a start on it. And by Sunday, I had finished it. It was written in 3 days. And it's quite short. It's about 30,000 words. So it's a novella again. And I sent it off to Fairlight and they've accepted it. And it's going to be published in spring next year, spring 2025, simply called Woman in Blue. So yeah, that was me.
Holy smokes.
Ingratiate myself for them, having let them down. Here, you can have this. I'm sending it to nobody else until you've decided whether you want it or not. And they decided they wanted it.
Oh my goodness. So your writing life is absolutely fascinating to me, and I bet your reading life's pretty darn interesting too. Tell us what you've been reading recently, Douglas.
So I had a trip to London just 2 weeks ago. And before I went down, I kind of was looking for things I might go and see in London. And on that particular occasion, I wasn't even looking. I just bumped into it. I bump into lots of things. I bumped into an exhibition that was going on, not in London, but just outside London, about half an hour's train ride from London, at a place called Milton Keynes. And there's a gallery there called the MK Gallery, and they were showing an exhibition of photographs by an American photographer called Saul Leiter, Leiter. I didn't know anything about him, but the images that they showed as promotion for the exhibition I thought were really interesting. So I immediately went and got a book of his photographs. It's called Forever Saul Leiter, and it's just a book of photographs. There are one or two small things that he says, like 2 lines that he says, that are quite pithy, and I think are mostly from this DVD, In No Great Hurry. And he's just a fascinating man. In the 50s and 60s, he was a fashion photographer for magazines like Harper's Bazaar, and he took rather unconventional fashion photographs, but he was well liked and made a handsome living out of it. And all the time he was taking street photographs. And he was a painter as well. He kind of, I suppose, went a little bit out of fashion, or went into the background a little bit. He didn't want to be famous. He didn't want fame and fortune or anything like that. But he just carried on plugging away, taking these photographs. And then he was sort of rediscovered when he was close to 80 years old. And somebody said, you should put a book of photographs together. So I put a book together. It was launched globally and he became a sensation. And several exhibitions have toured the world. This one is touring the world now, and its only stop in the UK is in Milton Keynes. So I went to see it on the basis of seeing the photographs in this book. So I would heartily recommend investigating him. Another writer that when I discover a writer, or when I bump into a writer I think I quite often want to read everything that they've ever written. And I'd read a book by the German writer Jenny Erpenbeck a couple of years ago. And I thought it was quite good, but it didn't prompt me to go and investigate any more. So I didn't think it was brilliant or great, but it probably was. I need to go back and read it. But then I bumped into this, which is called Kairos. And the first 100 pages are probably the best thing I've read in the last 5 years, the first 100 pages of it. The writing is just stunning. And so it's essentially about a 19-year-old girl who has an affair with a 56-year-old professor or something like that. They meet by chance on a train on a very wet day. And it's just a beautiful evocation of a love story. It becomes a bit abusive as the relationship breaks down, and that's the second half of the book, and it becomes quite unattractive and ugly and difficult to read sometimes. But the first half, I just was enchanted by it. I thought it was so lovely and so well written. And I also like books that you come away from and you've learned something, or the writer has shared some knowledge, something about the world, a fact that you never knew before. So like Blue Postcards, I share with you the life of Yves Klein, and you come away knowing quite a lot about Yves Klein at the end of it. And With or Without Angels, you learn about an artist you couldn't possibly have heard of before called Alan Smith. It might make you want to go and find out a bit more. And in this book, the professor takes it upon himself to educate this 19-year-old in particular areas of interest that he has. And one of the interests he has is classical music. He introduces her to a German composer called Hans Eisler, with particular reference, a short piece of music that he wrote to accompany a piece of film. It's a 60-minute short film, and all it is footage of rain. rain in gutters, rain on roofs, rain on the ground, rain on umbrellas, just 16 minutes of constant rain. Hans Eisler wrote a piece that's called 14 Ways of Describing Rain. And so what I've taken away from this book is that is a brilliant title. That's a novel, 14 Ways to Describe Rain. Now, normally, you heard me talk about how the title of With or Without Angels came around. Normally, I write something and then the title evolves. Here, I have a title waiting for a story, looking for a story, and I have bumped around with it for about 3 or 4 weeks, and I read something last week, and I think I have the start of a story that fits that title. So I'm really excited about that. But then after Jenny Erpenbeck's Kairos, I then went and got her book Visitation, which I've just finished yesterday, and it is wonderful. It's about a house and all these people that move into the house and then move out, and it's kind of held together by the fact that there's a large area of ground that, for want of a better word, we'll call a garden. And the person in charge of looking after that is called simply the gardener. And so we get chapters all the way through about the gardener and all he has to keep doing to the garden, how the garden changes with different owners. And it's in part, I suppose, a bit about German history in the 20th century. It's short, very, very short, 130 pages or something. And it's just fascinating. The writing is so devastating. That's the word I like to use just now, devastating. I've just seen a film called The Zone of Interest. It's a film that just claws at your insides, and yet you don't see anything particularly dreadful in the film. It's all in the background. It's all stuff that you don't see, but you know is going on. And there's a noise in the film, and it almost runs the entire film, this noise in the background that ordinarily people would have wiped it from the film because it interferes with the dialogue. But it's a constant noise, and it's the noise of the ovens in Holocaust. It's the noise of the ovens in operation and stuff. And it's just this constant clanking and humming noise in the background so that you know it's there. But what you get in front of you is a fairly ordinary domestic life going on with family, and it's just and this book has that same effect. You're getting the lives of all these people that inhabit the house. You're getting the life of the gardener, but it's quite devastating in a way. It's beautifully written. She's my writer of the moment. And lastly, I don't know if you've come across Nathalie Léger. There's 3 books. And they are bewitching, and you learn so much about stuff you would never have known about. So this one, for example, is called Sweet for Barbara Loden. Barbara Loden was an actress. She made a film towards the end of her career called Wander. The film's just called Wander. And this book is about, so Nathalie Léger, I think, works in a museum, and she does archives and stuff. And so she kind of goes on this journey of exploration to find out all about the film Wander and about Barbara Loden. But at the same time, there's lots of stuff going on about her mother and about her relationship with her mother. And that carries on through the 3 books. So this first one, that's the second book. This is the first book, really. But you can read them in any order. I read Barbara Loden first, and Exposition was my second book. It's about a countess in Paris. And for 40 years, I think it's in the 19th century, 40 years, she went to the same photographer and had monthly, I'm not just saying 40 years, she would go to this photographer very, very regularly and have a photograph taken, wearing costumes, posing. And she was a rare beauty. She wasn't a particularly nice person, and she wasn't particularly clever, but she was fated as the most beautiful woman in the world. And this is about all those photographs, but it's also about photographs and portraits and what they say and what they don't say. And the last one is The White Dress. And it's about this artist who decided to hitchhike from Milan to Jerusalem wearing a white wedding dress. And she gets murdered on the journey. And it becomes about an investigation into this. Why was she doing this? What was the point in wearing a white wedding dress? What was she trying to say? She would film it. She would film each day something about the day in her white wedding dress. And of course, the guy who murdered her took the camera and took his own pictures on the camera, and then he was found. And so there's footage of him, which is fairly banal. So it's all about this exploration that this museum archivist does into the story of the white wedding dress and the murder and the pointlessness of it, and the story of the murderer as well. It's fascinating reading, absolutely fascinating reading. I love those books.
I think I've heard the name of that author, but I don't know anything about her. Can you give us just a little bit about her?
That's it. That's all I have. I've been online to see if there are other books. I think there's one about Beckett. I think there's something about Beckett that she's written, but I'm sitting on the edge of my seat waiting for the next book, because I want to read so much. There's a Danish writer called Amalie Smith, and she's quite young. She's an artist. First and foremost, she's an artist. And I bumped into a book of hers called Marble. And it's so wonderful. It's quite experimental, but it is so wonderful as a book, because it's about the woman who discovered that classical statues weren't originally white, that they were actually very much painted. So these white marble statues had lots of paint applied. I mean, lots and lots of paint. And then just through the years that it got scrubbed off, or it fell off, or it got worn off through the passage of time. And people then thought the statues were beautiful white, and so they thought they were always white. And this Danish archaeologist came along and said, no, they weren't always white. And she proved, not by looking at the statues in the British Museum, because they'd all been scrubbed and cleaned for presentation, but freshly dug up ones she would immediately go to, and she would discover residue of paint on the statues. And so it's a part about that, and it's partly about someone who maybe a piece of marble, or maybe just has the name Marble. It's just wonderful. So she's got 2 books that are published in English now, translated into English, and they're difficult. They're not easy reads, particularly the second one, which is called Threadripper. It's quite difficult, but it's wonderful reading, absolutely wonderful reading. And I keep going on to the internet to see, is the next one out? Has she decided to have another one translated? And I don't think she's made huge waves in the English literary world. And I think it's a dreadful shame, because she is such a wonderful and exciting writer, because she's doing new things.
Wow. I'm not surprised, but you certainly have shown me today that you are as passionate a reader as you are a writer.
Well, I was an English teacher for most of my career, and I'm an English graduate as well as being an art graduate. I did 2 degrees, as it happened, one in graphics and illustration and one in English and philosophy. So I came slow to reading. So I hadn't read very much up until university. And then my English teacher said, oh, you should do a degree in English. So I said, okay. So I just followed what she told me to do. And I did this degree in English, and it was really good. And I read a lot, but I read a lot of Victorian literature, a lot of Shakespeare, a lot of D.H. Lawrence, and then it kind of stopped. I didn't read anything modern. And then I met the person I'm now married to, so my future wife. I met her, and she was a reader, and she had been a reader since the age of 5 and read a colossal amount. And so I felt like I was playing catch up with her, and she introduced me to modern literature, current literature. And so we used to, this was back in the sort of early 80s, we used to read all the books that were on the long list for the Booker before the Booker was announced, the Booker winner was announced. And you could do that then. And now there just seems to be so many books. And I think I've reached a stage now in my reading where although as a writer, I am absolutely driven by narrative, as a reader, yes, I want narrative, but I want somebody to be doing something different with it. Not just a different story, but a different way of telling it. something experimental. And I did an Arvon course, which is sort of for would-be writers. And it was run by Joanna Walsh, was one of the writers, and Toby Litt. And they introduced me to a wealth of reading material that I just didn't know about, like the Oulipo School and George Perec. And I mean, I have a vast range of experimental writers. And whilst I don't like all of them, because like the surrealist writers, I can't really get my head around, because although the writing's good, there isn't a narrative there. And for me, narrative is still absolutely essential. There has to be a story. So although the Blue Postcards is a completely experimental way of telling a story, but it does tell a story, and the story is important to me.
We'll stop there, but without a smidgen of exaggeration, this was a spellbinding conversation, Douglas. Thank you so much, Douglas.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you so much.